What's up, everybody? Hope you had a great weekend. I did. I wasn't working, so I actually had a wonderful weekend with the family. It was brilliant. Only caught up with the French GP late last night, so Sunday night. Obviously, was well into the football. Come on, England! Well done. That was a great result. But today is Q&A Monday, as ever. And we've had some great questions in this week, so thank you very much for all of those. I'm going to start trying to rattle through as many as I can. I'm going to start with this one, which actually came in last week. But thank you, Mr. Pigs, for using hashtag AskElvis, because it makes it so much easier for me to find them. Mr. Pigs says, I understand that most of the folks in the paddock are friends and know each other and were probably even colleagues at some point, but how much do they really casually disclose about the state of their car and the performance to other teams? I don't think that happens. When I was in the paddock working for the team for all those years, some of my best friends were working at the other team, so were therefore the opposition, and we socialised in the evenings, we hung out even in the paddock when we had a break, get on very, very well with them, but there's always this element of them being the opposition, and when it comes to anything technical or anything that might be considered a trade secret within your team, you just don't disclose that with anybody. So, you're all there to basically win. You're all there to make sure that your team does better than anybody else's. And so there's no way you would start slipping out in conversation any secret details that might either let your team down or help the opposition. So I really don't think that happens. Of course, there are conversations and jokey conversations about some of the things that might have gone wrong. And I'm sure those conversations will still be happening, but nothing that's really going to give any sort of game away. So you keep yourselves to yourselves when it comes to the competition, but very much socialise with other teams when it comes to the evenings or downtime. This one comes from Anjo. He says, like Force India in quali, several teams have already been penalised for sending out cars with wheel issues. If you remember at the French Grand Prix, Force India were penalised, they were fined for sending a car out. It's essentially an unsafe release because the car's been sent onto the track in an unsafe condition when a wheel detaches or has some problem. The question is, what happens to the crew member that made that mistake? Do they get dropped? Do they get reassigned or fired? The answer is, in short, no. People do make mistakes, and Formula One teams are full of humans. Much as the engineers and designers would love to kind of, make the whole thing engineer the whole thing into as exact a science as it can be, there are still humans involved at every stage, and humans make mistakes. And the one thing I always say to people, when somebody makes an error, whether it's in a pit stop or whether it's a design stage, manufacturing stage, even in a managerial phase, it doesn't matter what it is. If somebody in a team makes a mistake, that person is the best placed person to be part of the process that kind of gets over that analyses the problem, fixes it, and makes sure it can't happen again. So I think you have to use your mistakes, if you want to call them mistakes, in any team to be the focal point for developing in the future. And the person who's been central to making that mistake is probably the best person to be central in that role. Obviously, if mistakes continually happen, the same mistakes happen over and over again, you've got to seriously look at whether that one individual, if he's making the same mistakes over and again, is worthy and up to the job. But all of these people are up to the job. That's why they're in Formula One teams. That's why they're doing the job they do. So, no, people don't get fired for making a simple mistake. Okay. F1 Matty says, what are the logistical challenges for the teams with having 3 races in a row? And look, this is a logistical challenge. This is a long season anyway, 21 races. The first time F1's had a triple header. So these 3 races, so the French Grand Prix, Austrian Grand Prix and the British Grand Prix on 3 consecutive weekends. Well, what does it mean? Nothing really in terms of the job of the mechanics and engineers changes. So it's pretty much the same. So you'll do your work over the course of race week. Sunday night, last night, the French Grand Prix, the guys in the garage will have stripped the cars to whatever level they need to be stripped. The sort of rebuild process will go on. New parts or spares will have been pre-assembled for most teams, so they can be sort of cycled into the system. On a normal race, when you've got 2 weeks in between races, for example, they'd strip the cars, the bits would all go back to the factory, where they'd be, the sub-assembly guys would start stripping them down, servicing them, putting them back together, and then they go back onto the car the following week. Well, of course, we haven't got time for that. So certainly on the bigger teams, they will have a spare set of the key components that have already been through a servicing process, and they'll be ready to go back on the car. Some of the smaller teams will have to carry out that servicing process themselves at the racetrack, because there just isn't time for most teams to get very much stuff back to the factory and then back out again. Of course, bits can go back because people will have flown home on Sunday night. They can take things in their hand baggage, anything that urgently needs to get back to the factory can do, of course. We're not very far from most of the team's bases. So bits can get back and forwards. And of course, anyone who does go back to the factory on Sunday night, so that would be perhaps the management and various other people within the team, would fly home and take any bits home. They've got Sunday night, Monday, probably even Tuesday, to start turning bits around in the factory and get them back out to the racetrack in Austria on Wednesday, where they can be fitted to the car. That's no real biggie for the teams. If they got bits back on Wednesday, the cars can be built up again, re-scrutineered, go through the same process they would at any other race. For some teams though, or for most teams, certainly all the cars and most of the components and the trucks and everything will go straight from Austria last night, be packed up, be travelling through the course of today, Monday, out to Austria to the next race, where the garage teams will set up the garage, as they did do a week ago in France. So the race teams, i.e. the mechanics, the engineers, will start rolling back into the circuit probably on Wednesday, to start putting the cars back together. So starting their normal process essentially. Most race teams will work from Wednesday through to Sunday. That tends to be your race week at a European race. So nothing too much changes. It puts a bit more pressure onto the garage build team, who have to pack up everything very quickly Sunday night, get it into the trucks, drive everything, of course, by road to the next venue and get it set up again under more pressure than they normally would, because they have less time. Things like the motorhomes, of course, a huge operation, most of these motorhomes. And actually you'll find at some of these back-to-backs that some of the motorhomes are still being assembled whilst the media duties are being carried out in the downstairs part, for example. Bits are still happening around the rest of the motorhome. But these guys will work through the night, a huge team of people on the motorhomes that will continue their job right through the night to get it done in shift systems. I know that Red Bull, with their enormous, great big Red Bull energy station that houses both Red Bull Racing and Toro Rosso, they're lucky in a lucky position. They have 2 of those big units, and actually there was already one being set up at Austria before this weekend. So they're at home, they're at the Red Bull Ring, so they're in a lucky position. So the motorhome that they used in France will actually be packed up in a much more leisurely fashion and go straight onto the UK to Silverstone. What's the toughest thing about this is the fact that there is very little downtime, and for the guys in the teams, you're not getting home to see your families and friends, and that's what can hurt most people. That's what's the biggest human toll in all of this, is that you're away from home for long periods. That happens in Formula One anyway, but the worst case scenario is normally a back-to-back, so 2 weekends back-to-back, and then you manage to get home. This is 3 weekends of constant work, constant pressure. It's a bit like Groundhog Day, the same thing happening over and over again within 3 weeks. Sam Glover says, do you think the reason Mercedes haven't announced Lewis Hamilton's new contract yet is because they want to announce Bottas is staying at the same time and end all speculation about their driver lineup for next season? I don't think that's necessarily the reason. I think I don't think Lewis has put pen to paper yet on a Mercedes contract beyond this season. It sounds like that will probably happen. There are lots of discussions going on. They're at very advanced stages, and that normally means that the deal is more or less been hammered out. So whether it's a 2-year deal, highly likely to be a 2-year deal, because most drivers won't want to sign up beyond 2020 at this stage, not knowing what's coming for 2021. So they've probably hammered out the major details. 2-year contract, You know, probably got some sort of figure in terms of his salary in there, and it might be just things like, I know in the past he's had, you know, been spent a long time negotiating the finer points, like, do I get to keep the trophies? What are my own personal branding opportunities on the overalls or the cars or the crash helmet, and you know, how many media days am I obliged to do for the team? Those are the details that affect Lewis Hamilton's life. So how much is he committed to do for the team and for the team's partners? And he's in a strong position, of course, now where he can start to push back on some of those details, because you know, that's, you can't do that when you're a young racing driver just breaking into Formula One. You do exactly what you're told. But at this stage in his life, he can start to try to make his daily life, or his life, a little bit easier for him. I still think he wants to win in Formula One. I still think he wants more championships. He's in a great position to do that this year, of course. So I fully expect him to sign a contract beyond this year with Mercedes, and I actually expect Mercedes to do the same with Valtteri Bottas. Marc Jones says, we've seen 2 races where the thinner gauge Pirelli tyres have been used in Spain and France, both leading to Mercedes domination. Do you think the tyres are better suited to Mercedes than Ferrari? Well, I think there's 2 things here. Yes, I think that the thinner gauge tyres allow Mercedes to improve their the warm-up capabilities of their car on its tyres. So yes, I think that helps. But I think probably more important to that is you've got to factor in why Pirelli have brought those thinner gauge tyres. They brought them because of some circuit specific characteristics, and it's probably more that those circuit characteristics suit the Mercedes more so than the Ferrari. So I'm talking about the kind of new asphalt, the smooth asphalt, the low deg asphalt that both Barcelona and Paul Ricard had. Both of those circuits have a number of medium to high speed corners as well, which also seems to suit Marc, plus long straights, and the power unit, of course, that Mercedes has, particularly in its current form with the upgrade that they've brought to France. You know, I think has allowed them to crank that up a little bit more. So that's a bonus as well. And when you've got long straights like both of those circuits have, that's obviously an area they can capitalise on. So I think the circuit specifics perhaps suiting the car more so than the thinner gauge tyres. Don't forget, we're talking about 0.4 of a millimetre difference in tread depth. It's not very much. Yes, it will make a difference, but it's not a huge amount. So I think the circuit has more to do with the performance levels perhaps than the tyres themselves. Pablo Rodriguez says, was the Alfa Romeo Sauber a better car to drive around Paul Ricard than the McLaren? Wondering if Leclerc could have put the McLaren in Q3. He's on fire. You've got to say it was, yes. The Sauber was a better car around this racetrack than the McLaren. The McLaren really struggled this weekend, more so than it struggled at some other tracks. And I think that there's 2 things there. I think, A, this circuit clearly didn't suit their car, and it clearly did suit the Sauber. I think the Sauber has a great engine in that Ferrari that we know about, great power unit, and it also has some characteristics that seem to suit those smoother high-speed circuits. But I also think you've got to say that the McLaren, I guess, although it didn't suit the circuit, even as Fernando Alonso said, they weren't that far out of position. That's kind of where they are. They are in a fight with Sauber, and while Sauber excelled at the French Grand Prix, McLaren had a bit of an off weekend, if you like, or a poorer weekend, and that's the difference between the 2. They're underperforming, and right now I think you've got to say that Sauber, particularly with Charles Leclerc, are overperforming, or they're doing a great job. And that can be the difference between 2 teams. One goes one way, one goes the other, and the gap ends up being quite significant. Now, lots of you saying the big question, and this came from so many people, what did we think of Sebastian Vettels' 5-second penalty at yesterday's race? Was it fair? Was it too lenient? Was it harsh enough? Look, I think it's difficult, that one. I think you could easily argue it should have been a 10-second penalty, but would that have made a huge difference to the outcome of a race? I'm not sure. The question for me here is, when you're applying penalties like that, Now, the first thing is it's got to be consistent. Now, I don't think there is necessarily 100% consistency, because we've seen Max Verstappen get a 10-second penalty in China for a similar kind of thing. So you've got to have consistency. That's all the drivers would really ask for, and I guess fans as well just want consistency. The second thing is, how do you apply that penalty? How do you look at it and say what's worthy of 5 and what's worthy of 10 seconds? Is it because you're looking at the consequence? So, i.e., he's taken out Valtteri Bottas and ruined his race. And in the end, of course, Seb ended up finishing ahead of Valtteri. So that looks on paper like it doesn't. The 5-second penalty made no difference. But you've got to factor in here, you've got to remember rather, that Valtteri finished behind Seb not just because of the fact that he was spun round and started the restart after that safety car behind Seb, because don't forget he was right behind Seb. The bigger consequence, which wasn't really noticed or understood until the end of the race, was how much Valtteri's car had been damaged in that incident and what the longer term effect of that was over the course of a race. If you think about it, after the safety car, Valtteri and Seb, although right at the back, were right next to each other. Seb managed to plough his way through the field, whereas Valtteri was suffering because of damage to his floor and loss of aerodynamic downforce, which cost him, over the course of the entire Grand Prix, cost him a huge amount of time, and he wasn't able to progress as far forward as Seb. But the stewards, of course, when they're looking at the incident straight after it, after the first lap, can't really factor in the longer term effect of whatever the damage was to Valtteri's car. All they can factor in is the spin. So, yes, I think you could easily argue it should have been 10 seconds on the grounds of consistency, because that's what Max got earlier in the season. But whether it's 5 or 10 seconds, I'm not sure that it really makes too much difference in terms of that specific incident. It was very unlucky for Valtteri because it was no fault of his own, but it cost him dearly in the race because of the damage that was incurred on his car. It could have very easily been the other way around. It could have easily been that he'd had no floor damage and Seb had damaged, the front of his floor if the wing had gone under the car, for example, and it could have been Seb that suffered with aerodynamic downforce loss, and he could have been languishing at the back, and Valtteri could have ploughed through the field with his faster car to finish 5th, and then we'd perhaps not be saying that a 5-second penalty was not harsh enough. So it's a very difficult one for the stewards. The biggest point out of all of this for me is that we need consistency. And if you're looking to get consistency, I think you have to have some consistency in the stewards. So, somebody who's a constant all the way through the season, who can, somebody who would have been there making the decision for Max's penalty, who can then come along and go, look, same thing happened here, or similar thing happened back in China. This is what we did. Let's consider that. They should be able to do that anyway, of course. That's all, recorded historically. We all know what happened in China. But I think it would be great to have a consistent voice on the stewarding panel at every single race that's there. So consistency is what we want, but you've got to look at each case individually and say it's very easy after the race to say that one person, i.e. Seb, didn't suffer too much, whereas Valtteri did. That was pure luck or bad luck on Valtteri's part, and it could have very easily been the other way around. Perhaps then it wouldn't have been so much of an issue. Right, this has already been a very long video, I appreciate, so thanks for sticking with me if you've been here since the beginning. But there's still so many great questions this week, more than I've had, I think, in any other video. So if you'll indulge me, I am going to do a part 2 to this. So I'm going to do another one, which I'll upload tomorrow. So one up today on Monday, part 2 up on Tuesday. So if you want to keep questions coming in overnight, then feel free to do so, that'd be great. But I've already got loads, and so I'll select a few of those and do part 2 tomorrow. So thanks very much, guys. Do like the video, share it around, please. I'd really appreciate it. And subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. I'll see you tomorrow.